everyone, and welcome to Alchemy Live, Episode 2. I am your host, Jessica Levity. With me, as always, my fellow alchemist, Christopher Daniels. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Churl. How you be doing?
Oh, good. How you be doing?
You know, just living my best quarantine life.
Oh, good. And joining us also, because he heard what we were going to be talking about, and he thought it was so juicy, he wanted in on it. It's Professor Daylover. What up, boo?
Yo, what's going on, babe?
Just listening to you walk around upstairs.
Scenes from The Day Lovers and Quarantine.
Totally. And our very special guest today, my favorite anarchist theologian, Ian Callahan.
Hello.
Hi, Ian.
Hello, how are you?
Do you want to tell everyone why I call you an anarchist theologian?
I was actually going to give you a different term to call me if
God, please.
I would refer to it, well, Peter Rollins would refer to it as a pyro theologian.
As a what?
Pyro theologian.
Oh.
Like, you burn things down.
I like pyro theologian. That's hot. It plays into your whole punk rock like thing.
There you go.
Yeah. I'm really excited to have you on this episode because basically what happened is we aired episode 1, The Fisher King. You listened to it and then you sent me a delicious 20-minute video response. And I was like, all right, we have to do another episode because I want to hear your thoughts. So right now, I'm going to have Chris give us a 2-minute summary of the Fisher King tale so that we can catch anyone up who maybe didn't watch episode 1 or needs a refresher. And then it's all on you, boo. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All of you. All my business.
I was like, which boo you referring to?
All of them. All right. So Chris, let's start with you. Give me the 2 minutes.
The 2 minute, and she has emphasized my 2 minutes have not started yet. It does not start until I say the pivotal words that begin every single myth. Once upon a time. So once upon a time, there's a prince. He was gallivanting in the forest because he loved it so much. And all of a sudden, he came across his camp, and there was some salmon. He's like, "Ooh, salmon! I'm gonna have some of that." Ooh, but then it was too hot, so he spit it out. And then all of a sudden, the spear went through his genitals, and he's like, "Ah, I'm wounded." So he goes back into his kingdom, and all of a sudden, there's a malaise about life, and he hates everything, and becomes super, super cold. Meanwhile, flash forward to Perceval. Perceval was this naive, innocent fool whose mama didn't want him to become a knight. Well, as things go, he became a knight, and he started doing all these different quests. And he started going all around saving damsels and hunting dragons, and then he comes across the Fisher King in his boat fishing because that's the only way that he is assuaged from his wound. And the Fisher King tells him he can stay at his castle, so he goes around in the drawbridge and he goes into the castle. Whoo! Did he know there was a party happening? And all of a sudden, all these mysterious objects get taken out, including the Holy Grail, and all these people be drinking it and having their truest desires come to fruition. Only the Fisher King's not able to enjoy it because he is so wounded. And all Perceval needs to do is ask the question, which he does not do for a myriad of reasons that we can go into later. He gets kicked out of the castle. 20 years goes by. He does all these amazing feats, gets married, has children, but all of a sudden has lost the taste for all of his questing and being knight and everything. And just when you think he's about to give up on life itself, he comes across the Grail Castle again. And this time he's prepared, he's matured, he has done his inner work, and he asks the question, whom does the Grail serve? And oh, the Fisher King is restored to his health, and Perceval goes home, and the Fisher King dies. The end.
Holy shit. Wow. Impressive.
Thank you so much.
Very impressive, Churl, even
Thank
for
you.
you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Reno's #1 spiritual advisor and minister, voted 2 years in a row. Which is very interesting. Okay, so Ian, you listened to our first episode where we took much longer than 2 minutes to retell that tale, and then we dove in to what we believed it was revealing. And you made some really interesting connections, and I want to talk about how that myth landed in your world and what's the first thing that you found listening to that story.
Yeah, I think the first thing that really started to connect in my brain, and then you guys ended up talking about it, which was really cool, was the Garden of Eden and how, you know, there's this relative kind of land that this prince lives in where he has everything he needs and wants, and everything is at his disposal until he comes upon this salmon or meat or whatever it is that he wants, and it's not his, and he takes it. And that was where I started thinking, you know, Garden of Eden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So for me, it kind of started connecting with, okay, that's what starts the curse, is a trespass. He trespasses by taking what isn't his, what he can't have, rightfully. The same thing could be said then if this is a parallel to the story of mankind with Adam and Eve and the fall of man, taking what the one thing they were forbidden from having was the ultimate trespass. And then that brought upon this curse that has lasted, you know, and is passed on to all the further generations. I kind of connected the suffering of the Fisher King and the mortal wound that he suffered that didn't allow him to connect with his kingdom and get from his kingdom what he wanted, with the fall of Adam and Eve and the fall of mankind and their inability to connect with the kingdom they were created for, their fall from Eden.
I think it's super interesting because you're talking about in the Garden of Eden and also in the prince's kingdom, he had everything he wanted, but then he wanted more.
Right.
And that is first, you know, I did listen to obviously your response video, but for some reason in this moment, this is hitting me in a new way of that's so relevant to right now and kind of consumer culture and the way that, even though we have all of our needs met, we still want more. It never seems to be enough. And that does seem to be our downfall.
You can even take that a little further and take the connection part in it. You know, here we are all connected. Here we all have what we need, but we all still feel so disconnected and we're not satisfied. And it's, you know, we're starting to grumble and we're starting to go insane and go crazy. And, you know, it's getting old, right? Even though you're right, we do have all our needs met. For you know, those of us who are fortunate enough to.
Yes, it's definitely not everyone.
Definitely not the same for everyone. Absolutely.
But those of us who are taking more than we need is the problem. Those are the people that I'm talking about. Right. So you brought up that this is a wound that causes separateness. And I want you to dive into that.
Well, so for the prince, for the Fisher King, right? He's in this kingdom, in which if you go back and watch your guys' episode 1, you'll understand more about his living in this kingdom, right? Where everyone else is taking of the Holy Grail and everyone else is realizing their fantasies and their dreams, but the Fisher King isn't, right? He's kind of unsatisfied and this wound still haunts him. And then correct me if I'm wrong at any point, right? But he can't be fully connected because of this wound that ails him. And I think the same could be said for Adam and Eve and mankind, is that their fall from grace prohibits them from partaking in the kingdom of Eden, right? And they fall and they're not capable of partaking in what was designed for them, what they were designed for. So, and if you look, and of course, I'm not speaking literally. I don't really even necessarily believe in the literal Adam, but I think that there's power in the story and in the myth as a representation of mankind in general. And I see that still haunts mankind. Obviously, you just brought up one way that it does that, but we could bring up any millions of ways how this need for more and this unhappiness and this insatiability of mankind is really the premise for all of our problems. The want for more is kind of the root of all the world's troubles. So where I ended up connecting from there was obviously the Adam and Eve story goes through Mosaic law and it culminates into the story of Jesus, the messianic story of Christ. And I still kind of looked at the Fisher King as an allegory for this whole narrative, this Christ narrative. So I don't want to jump ahead too much. I don't know if I'm answering a question you have coming, but
no, you tied it into the Christ narrative, and I want you to just keep going on that because that is what was so brilliant about the video response that you sent us. was that you drew this relation to the entire Christ narrative. So I'm willing to just let you flow if you want to flow, and we are gonna take it deeper where we feel like we want to go in deeper.
Okay. So the Christ narrative picks up, Christ is the Messiah, right? And the Messiah is the one who's going to save God's people from the rest of the world. And depending on, lots of different people had different expectations for the Messiah, obviously. But the modern Christian version of the Messiah is Jesus came to save all of mankind from evil, from sin, from the consequences of sin, and so forth. So starting with that, I kind of want to preface that with diving into the notion of sin, because I think that makes all the difference on how you look at that. So I will start by just reading a few verses from the book of John.
I love how your shirt is Murder City.
That's the Murder City Devils. Yeah. John 8, starting verse 1, going through verse 12. It says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives early in the morning. He came to the temple. All the people came to him and sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who they had caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, 'Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?' This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground." And it pisses me off that they never tell you what he wrote. That's not the only thing that does that. But and as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." So I'll talk about where I get my evidence for what sin no more means, or what the word sin means, in a second. But where I think that connects is, I believe this is where Christianity gets the idea of sin wrong. And this is where I believe that the religion of Christianity, this is where their house of cards is built upon. And so if you remove this card, the whole thing falls down. It is what props up the heaven and hell narrative and everything else. If you remove this idea of sin, none of that other stuff adds up. So I think they get the word sin wrong because it's equated to deeds. Sin is looked at as actions, good and bad things. They're just doing bad things. And I don't believe that's what Jesus is talking about here. In fact, he couldn't be, because obviously she was guilty of adultery. She didn't deny it. But he changed the narrative, and he first turned it on everybody else and said, "He who's without sin cast the first stone." And then he said, "Who is there to condemn you? No one? Well, neither do I condemn you," right? So he's not worried about her deeds. But then he turns around and tells her, "Go and sin no more." Now, if he's talking about deeds, how does he expect her to just go and not ever do that again, right? That doesn't make sense. That he would all of a sudden be talking about deeds, even though he doesn't condemn her, but he's worried that she doesn't do it again. That doesn't add up, right? So I think that he's talking about something different when he talks about sin. Go and sin no more. And it's not too uncommon to hear this, even among Bible scholars, but they'll say that the word sin means, it's an archery term, an ancient archery term. When you miss the bullseye, it means to sin. But what it really comes from is the Hebrew word, and I'm probably mispronouncing this, but it's chaitam, which is an archery term. But I'll read my evidence from the Old Testament, just so everybody knows I'm not just pulling this out of my...
Boo came with resources.
Right. All right, so this is Bathsheba talking to King David and worried about, he's on his deathbed, and she's worried about their son Solomon becoming king or not. And she says, my lord the king, this is 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 20. My lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you, to learn from you who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise, as soon as the Lord my king is laid to rest with his ancestors, and my son Solomon and I will be treated as criminals. So she's worried about if he doesn't become king, she and her son will be as criminals. The word, now that's the modern New International Version translation. It's like the worst translation you could possibly have. But the treated as criminals is actually probably closer to the meaning for sin than anything else, because the Hebrew word used there is chaitim, which means sin. We will be treated as sinners. And like criminals is actually pretty close to the context of, she's not worried that we're going to be treated like people who do naughty things, right? She's worried about, we're going to be outsiders. We're no longer going to be royalty. We're no longer going to be a part of the kingdom. We're going to be cast out like criminals would be. What do you do to criminals? You put them in jail. You cast them out of society. So the word sin, I believe what Jesus is talking about, and if you really research every time that word is used in scripture, it seems to have the same context, but it's talking about a disconnection from what you were meant for. He's talking about a disconnection from the kingdom of God. And that's the state that mankind finds themselves in, is an unnatural state, a state of disconnection, a state like the Fisher King is in, where they have an ongoing wound that separates them from what they're meant to be connected to. So when he says to the woman, go and sin no more, he's saying, listen, I just made this right for you. I just showed you that you're okay. I just took away everybody who was persecuting you and accusing you, and I made you their equal. In fact, I exalted you above them. Now go and be in sin no more. Be disconnected no more. So I don't think sin is about deeds. And I won't go off on my salvation rant.
Ooh, but I kind of want you.
That's another time.
Okay, another episode. Put it in our cache. So you know what really made me think of is he says, like, where are your condemners? And she's like, they're not around. Then he says, and neither do I condemn you. To me, he's changing the meaning. Like, he's getting into the semiology. He's saying that without condemnation, then sin doesn't exist. And that's what I'm taking by the, like, and so go and sin no more. It's not a thing. It's impossible to sin if there isn't someone to condemn you.
Correct. Yeah. If you're not being cast out as an outsider, then you're on the inside now.
If there isn't someone willing to push you out, then you can't create the separation in the first place.
Right.
Wow.
Well, I really appreciate that view and that interpretation, because a house of cards is an appropriate metaphor. If there's no value judgment around deeds connected to sin, then you can't designate someone as being worthy of heaven or hell. They're just a human being, a flawed human being. And we're all connected in that essential flaw that we don't have everything that we need. And so it kind of all goes back to that Fisher King story of, well, why did he eat the salmon in the first place? What was lacking? What void was attempting to be fulfilled with the transgression? And so we could ask that of ourselves when we are erring, or when we are acting out of sin, acting out of disconnection, acting out of needing something that we can't really fulfill externally. What's really motivating us is trying to fulfill that void. And so that's kind of the trajectory that I was on based off of your interpretation of the Fisher King and then your reading of the Bible, which was appreciated.
Very cool.
Yeah, I love everything that you're saying about separation. And I think tying it to the Fisher King, what often gets misinterpreted is that the tale of the Fisher King is not actually about the Fisher King. It's actually about Perceval's journey. Right. And it's about his transformation And the Fisher King wound is the wound that Perceval has, that we all have. And the way that Robert Johnson interprets it is a self condemnation. So his interpretation is that the salmon is that touch of Christ consciousness that we come into very early on in our life, and that we're often unprepared for. And I think in the Garden of Eden, the sort of important aspect that I take is, how did Adam respond when he bit the apple? What did he do? He had shame, he had guilt, and he tried to hide from God. And I think that's a little bit what happened with the Fisher King, is all of a sudden the wound is so aptly placed in his generative region, and suddenly the narrative becomes about performance, and it suddenly comes about that feeling creative aspect of masculinity. And so much of the treachery and toxicity and abuse that comes about is from men trying to perform, men feeling inadequate because they're unable to perform, men feeling like they need to gather power and resources and money and wealth as a substitution to this very natural feeling connection that we have. And you almost sacrifice that part in order to attain this other element. And then you find that you have a distaste for it because you have lost that connection to that very divine paradise feeling that's within us. And so Perceval's journey is about, who is he serving? What is he really doing? Like you're saying, that purpose. He thinks it's to become a knight, and so he spends his entire life doing everything that's asked of him as a knight, and yet still feels that malaise and that feeling of disconnection, and that somehow it means nothing, because in the end he realized that it doesn't, because it was self-serving. Mm-hmm. And he gets that taste of what his life could be. He sort of gets a glimpse of that divine purpose, and he gets an opportunity to bring that into consciousness the first time he enters the Grail Castle. But because of fear, because of a holding on to his past, or whatever hang-ups he may have had, he doesn't do that. But it's only through the maturity of his journey that he's then able to finally ask the question in the end.
Right. And yeah, I really like that part of it, where the innocent question of who does the Grail serve is the magic trick that undoes the curse, right? And unbeknownst to Perceval, that's what does it. Where I would relate that back to the Christ narrative was, Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, right? And I think Christianity, again, misinterprets that a lot. But the way I've kind of always looked at that is that he's the son, right? So he's birthed of the divine, but he's of man physically. He's a human being. He took the form of man, and not in this way where he walked around feeling like he was God. I don't see evidence for that in the story. I don't see evidence that he rolled around just thinking, I'm this omnipotent, omnipresent being, and I'm stuck in this body, but I can do anything I want. I think that we see Jesus doing a lot of what he did through magic and through mysticism and through parables and all this really mystic sort of stuff. And I think Jesus probably went and spent a lot of time with the Essenes in the desert before he came back and started his ministry, because they were very mystical, and a lot of the Kabbalism and everything they were a part of lines up with what he ended up doing.
Oh yeah.
So I think that he didn't fully realize the extent to which he was going to take on this curse of man until he found himself on the cross and he cried out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. When he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? In that moment, I believe he blasphemed God. He became holy man at that point. He became and embodied the curse and the separation and the dissatisfaction that mankind is haunted by 100% in that moment when he decried God's goodness and he questions God's motive and questions God's goodness by saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, if he knew, I mean, Jesus knew the deal, right? I mean, he should have known, right, why he was up there. He should know why God's forsaking him, but he seems not to. He seems to be dissatisfied with the fact that God has forsaken him, and he seems pretty pissed about it. So I would say in that moment, Christ takes on Adam's form as a blasphemous, disobedient anarchist, as he's decrying God's goodness, right? And then, you know, as he says, it is finished, the magic trick is over. And once he says it is finished, Father, in your hands I commend my spirit. I think those are pretty absolute words. I don't think Easter Sunday is it is finished. It's finished, but in 3 days from now, it'll actually finish. No, it was finished right there. There's no resurrection is needed. So, and I won't go on that tangent either. That was our Easter tangent when we were talking, but our Good Friday talk. But anyway.
Well, you said, that's right. Easter Sunday is to console those who refuse to believe in Good Friday.
Right.
I was like,
I think the heavy lifting. Yeah, I think the heavy lifting of all of it was done on Good Friday. I think it was done on the cross, and when Christ said it's finished, I think that's what he meant, and I think that was the trick. That was, and the temple veil was rent in that moment. The temple veil was what separated God from man in the temple. The Holy of Holies was on the other side of the temple veil. And when Christ said it is finished and he gave up his spirit, that was when the temple veil was ripped in half. In other words, this disconnection between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man was opened up. That gateway was opened up in that moment. And it took Christ being innocent. My God, why have you forsaken me? What the hell have I done wrong? He didn't deserve to be up there. He wasn't a murderer. He was getting a murderer's death. He was getting Barabbas's death that he deserved, right? So he was being crucified unjustly. So it was that innocence that it required for him to take on the true form of man and to then open up, like Perceval does, change this curse that it has been, by basically making it to where he gave his life to set us back into the kingdom, to where we can now assume his place as mankind. He became man and died so that mankind could go and sin no more. And I think that the trick of the Perceval asking, whom does the Grail serve? It wasn't just saying abracadabra, but it was the fact that he was asking about the fact that the Grail is something greater than himself. He realized this Grail isn't just serving me. It's got to be connected to something more here. And the fact that he would remove himself from the equation, it seems very Buddhist to me, or very Taoist, kind of the removing of himself from the equation. And that's when he gets it, that okay, it comes all the way, it brings it back full circle in that moment. Once
the metaphysical magic of the question that ends the spell is the fact that it rests on reminding him that there's something bigger than him.
And Christ would say, what greater love does a person have for his friends than that he would lay down his life? Right? So if Christ did the ultimate act of love by laying down his life, really the resurrection takes power away from that, honestly. And so that's why I'm not an Easter Sunday Christian. I'm a Good Friday Christian. I'm gonna apostate for sure. But I think that's where the magic trick is that realizing that there is a sacrifice. There was this giving up by Perceval of this partaking in the grail for his own self, and he yielded to who it actually serves. And in Christ did the same thing.
And that seems like what we would be calling upon ourselves to do now as humanity, to be, especially with climate change, and then as well as with the virus TM, is to begin making decisions that serve the greater good. To not so much lay our life down, but to lay down the life that we have been previously entitled, accustomed, and possibly addicted to.
This might be a good time to bring up the Wei Wu Wei.
Wei Wu Wei, yeah. Go for it.
When I was talking to you before about it, I was reminded of this quote.
Well, while you pull it up, I want to get Chris's thoughts on everything that just came out.
Wow. It was a lot. I had never heard the Good Friday Christian and the Easter Sunday Christian, so thank you for that. I'm going to file that away in a deep recess to reflect upon, because I was never a Good Friday Christian. I was always an Easter Sunday Christian, mainly for the brunch, and I realized that like nothing serves Christ like brunch, and that was always where my metaphysics lie. I think, when I was listening, like everything that you're saying, I firmly believe it, and it hits this note of truth. But I think so much with alchemical reactions and magic that happens, there's when the wielder knows, and then when sort of the masses know. And I think maybe in that moment, you're absolutely right. Christ says it's finished, and it is. But sometimes people are a little slow to the uptake, and they need that little bit of time to sort of come around. And I think that's a question that's sort of circulating right now, maybe unexpressed, is what is it going to take? Because there's just this deep feeling of, we think we have hit this revelatory moment where we suddenly see those sins of separation, and we suddenly see those things that aren't working, and yet we are given this choice, and time again are not choosing to make a different choice. And so we keep thinking there's no way, there's no moving forward in the old paradigm with the way that things are. And then you see things like the protests that are happening, you're like, oh my god, like there's no there's no sense and there's no rationality. And what's funny in the Fisher King story is that we sacrifice that natural instinct for cool rationality, and there seems to be at odds. But Robert Johnson has a great way of saying that nature and culture, it's not about sacrificing one for the other, but finding the right and appropriate time when each serves its purpose and each becomes appropriate. And I think right now what we're seeing is people's darker nature emerging and sort of bypassing that rational sense. And so there's no amount of logic that is going to deter them from this instinctual feeling of, this is what I'm owed, this is what I'm entitled to, this is what I deserve. And I think these are distorted, toxic narratives that have just been repeated over and over and over again. I think that's why we're starting to see the downfall of celebrityism a little bit, because now we're seeing all these celebrities that are coming out and saying, oh, we're just like you, and oh, we're in this together, and oh, I feel this prison that I'm in right now in my $25 million mansion. And everyone's like, I'm sorry, cut through that noise. I ain't buying it no more.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that's a a great segue into this quote. I'm going to just interject this and like keep going. But Wei Wu Wei would say, he says, why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and of everything you do is for yourself. And there isn't one, meaning there isn't one of yourself. Like yourself is nothing outside of how it connects to everyone else and how it connects to the kingdom.
Read it again and then let it hang. Like,
Okay.
finish it.
Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and of everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one.
Man, that is some freaking metaphysical just heroin right there. For me, it's very much like the total number of minds in the universe is one. Yeah. Joe, did you have something?
Yeah, just the way I took that last part is that there is no self to conceive of, because if you have an idea of you as a self, then that self is then automatically separated, disconnected from source. Then there is a source and then there is a self. And so if there is no self, then we can return to that pre-wound state of we don't need to seek, we don't need to do, because there is no we, there is no I, right? There is just gong. Insert the sound of the gong. There is no self to define.
Right. And, since we do have the professor on, that's why the Tao says language is so problematic, because it creates a subject and then a verb and then an object, and there's separation within that in and of itself. And it's like Jesus saying, I don't condemn you, so great, go and sin no more. Without the condemner, the sin doesn't exist. So without the self, separation doesn't exist. Man, and that's dying on the cross, he says it's finished, because I feel like he took the whole of existence into himself. He stayed present and conscious. He died consciously. Like, he wasn't on meds, he suffered, and suffering keeps us right here, right? So when they dose you with pain meds, palliative care, at the end, like, you feel good, you do not feel pain, but the downside of that is that you are not conscious and you cannot die consciously. And I feel like Christ being tortured and suffering up on that cross kept him conscious, and it kept him right here, and it kept him human. And for me, shamanically, that was some shaman shit that he did up there. And I feel like crying out, God, why have you forsaken me, was him plunging into the darkness, into the void, into the other side. And you and I differ there, Ian, because you say he really felt that fear. And I say he was just using that phrase as a gateway into the total void, into the total darkness. Almost like this last cry of self, this last cry of, I'm going to go over to the extreme of there is a me. Why have you forsaken me? Only to then come out and undo that completely. Thought?
Good thought. Yeah, it is. I haven't thought of that before.
But I think isn't that the whole, we have the God creator, the Christ aspect within us, but that separation created that ego to serve as a contrast to what that God creator principle is not. And God's bestowed gift of free will is the choice to return home.
There it is.
That's the journey. That's the whom does the Grail serve, is this willing choice to return and come home. And that home is that abiding in the center of the heaven of kingdom within you. And I think that's part of that returning and that remembering and going through all these things that we are, and that choice is always there. In the Fisher King tale, the Grail castle's never far. That veil of consciousness is never far away from you. It's always accessible. But I think right now with the virus TMC, is we're so close to touching it, and it's freaking people out, because I think there's a choice that we're all being given during this time. And I think some people are making that choice, and I think other people are so frenzied by it. They're so in fear of that choice itself and what it will mean, that's why it's like the itching to reemerge. It's like, I can't be here anymore. Oh, I can't. We just got to reopen, and they're just so desperate to get out. And if they just sit a little bit longer and just be in that space a little bit longer.
Yeah, it would also make sense why everybody's projecting it onto everyone else too. It's everyone else's fault. This is the way these people are acting is the cause of it. No, the way these people are acting is the cause of it. All right, and it's all of us, really. But yeah, you're right. This is so serendipitous in a really shitty way that we're in this quarantine, because it does relate a lot. And I think another way too is like the idea that there is no self. There's a lot of people that are quarantined literally all by themselves. I mean, I'm fortunate I have my kids with me and a few other people around here and there, and I see people still, but there's some people that are literally all the time. For a month and a half now, they've not seen another human being. And I think they especially are probably realizing very acutely, being by yourself absolutely is not sustainable forever. Even if you're an introvert, you're still wired for human connection. You're still wired for some outside of yourself. We still need each other, and we still need the kingdom.
Yeah, I think that's quite relevant in the context of this pandemic, because I think something that's really common now is people would rather disconnect and just stay at home and watch Netflix all day. And here comes the universe going, okay, well, here, you can do that. How long will that last you before you're itching to just get back out and feed that connection of like, well, too much of something good can be really bad. And when I talk to all of my students about it, they've watched everything on Netflix. They've exhausted the queue. And so, what's that?
Nothing.
I just think it proves fundamentally that is something that we're all seeking, is that connection. And isolation is also good in its own way and serves its purpose, but is largely unsustainable. And that is one thing among many things that is being revealed right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
I just wanted to comment on Professor Day Lovers. I think it's that perspective of what isolation is, because there's another great tale which we'll have to do an episode about, called the Handless Maiden tale, or Silver Hands, or the Armless Maiden, which is sort of the divine feminine counterpart to the Fisher King tale. But so many of these mythic tales, and even biblical stories and parables, is about someone going into nature for an extended period of time by themselves and being with themselves, and eventually reestablishing that connection to spirit, to God. And I think that's what is being offered and invited for us to do. It's not about self-improvement. It's not about, fixing all your wounding and all of your, this, that, and the other thing. It's not about learning a new language. It's not about all these things. It's about, here's this time that in some ways we need, because we often say, oh, I'm too distracted. Oh, I'm too busy. Oh, I have all these things going on, and I can't just simply sit and be with God. And I think God is always there, being like, yo, I'm right here. Like anytime you just want to say hey, and you just want to be with me, we can hang. And people go, oh, it's like a parent where you go, oh, I'll call them later. Oh, I will.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you at some point, you know, and 2 years goes by and you're like, oh my God.
Never call.
But I think, you know, that isolation, that feeling of loneliness and isolation is so very real. And that feeling of disconnection because of things like the Fisher King wound is so very real. That feeling of separateness, that feeling that I'm all alone, that I don't have anyone. And that's a very real feeling, and wanting to honor that. And that space that we can move into is that I'm not really alone, that I really am connected to that source, to that spirit, to that energy. I simply have to ask the question. I don't need to answer it. I don't need to have, you know, the grand plan. I don't need to divine, you know, any of the inner workings or the master theories. All I need to do is just simply sit and ask the question.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting observation too, because it really, for me, confirms our inability to sit. Is we've been gifted this time to just sit, and here we go going, oh, well, I have to lose the weight, I have to write the book, I have to meditate, I have to do all these things. And if I don't use my time productively, then I've wasted my quarantine. And here's God going, no, you don't have to, you can do those things, great, but you don't have to. You can just sit and just be and just pause. And it's really a hard thing for people to do, is to do nothing, to just pause.
And
Yeah, we live in a society. Go ahead, Jess.
Oh, I was just going to say really quickly that I know in last episode we talked about just the humility it takes to ask a question. So you were talking about it's not that the magic phrase was a statement, it was a question. And I brought up that there's a lot of humility that comes in asking a question. And I just think for men in particular, men are expected to know the answers and not to ask questions. And whether that's they refuse to ask for directions, or, you know, just the other day, like we've been redoing our kitchen and trying to figure out garden stuff and having to be like, we can just ask someone. Like, we don't have to figure it out ourselves. It's okay to ask for help. And it's okay to be reminded that there's something bigger than us. That's all I was going to say. Off to you, Ian.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it is hard to do. I think for men or women. I don't know, particularly for women. Women like to cast that all on men, but women have a hard time asking for help too, I think, in other ways. But we all do. It's human, you know, it's the ego. We don't want to ask. We don't want to be vulnerable, for sure. I was going to say, on the professor's point, is that, yeah, we live in a society of deeds, where it's, you know, you must do. And if you don't, there's something wrong. And I had some grandiose point I was going to make about that. But yeah, I guess, well, that's what it was, bringing it back to Wu Wei. That's what's so cool about it, that I'm fascinated by, with the philosophy of Wu Wei, which is the art of doing nothing. And Wu Wei puts it as a bird doesn't fly all the time. In fact, most of the time a bird sits, and they conserve their energy, and they wait and they watch and they look. And when they see the opportunity, then they fly and they go get some food or whatever, and then they go back to sitting. But that's a great analogy for, we think we need to fly all the time, and you can't. And religion would say, most religions would say the same thing. You need to do. Even those who believe that they're saved by grace, the way they measure whether or not they're saved by grace or not is by their deeds. So really, it just comes full circle back around to deeds. And it's a fallacy. It sets you up for failure.
Right, because part of what Christ's ministry was to say, well, it more matters what's in your heart and what you're acting out of, because you can do, but why are you doing?
Exactly. Don't be
for what?
Right.
Yeah.
So ironically, Christ was a Kantian and not a utilitarian. That's
I think what like sort of what you were alluding to earlier, Ian, there's so much misinterpretation and misconception. And one of the things that I read that really resonated with me is that the Christ energy is a dynamic energy. It is kinetic, it's action. And so compassion is God's love in action. And I think we misinterpret that a lot for passive compassion of like, oh, if I simply express that this is sad, or if I share something on Facebook, then like that's my part, like I'm doing enough.
Praying for you.
Yeah. And, you know, I think we see from the stories of Jesus that he was like, no, like you need to take some action. There's some shit that is messed up here and we need to turn that around.
Yeah.
And so I think where spirituality becomes so egocentric and selfish is all of that energy and intention becomes about your self-improvement. And something that I've heard and is this idea that you know, it starts with you, and that you need to do this inner work first before the outer work can happen, or by doing the inner work then the outer world will shift and change. And I believe that, but I think it's a trap that people then get rooted in their own selfishness and get rooted in their own world and all of their, you know, what's important to them and how this serves them. And it gets further away from the Grail question of whom does the Grail serve?
Right.
Is that it's not about your self-improvement. It's not about how others see you. It's not about, because all of the work is about realigning with that divine energy and being a source and conduit for that. But if you don't take any action and if you don't shift and move mountains in your world, then that energy has nowhere to go. You know, it doesn't, it's, you know, you're not a repository that it then just simmers and collects and you're saving it for a rainy day and, ooh, you know.
Yeah, it's just lip service, you know, it's not action. And yeah, judging a person by their, you know, actions speak louder than words, right? It's common sense, but.
Actions speak louder than words, and yet it's the thought that counts.
Oh, dang it.
I know, I've always thought that.
You got to think about your actions.
I know, it's a paradox. Well, I want to wrap this up, and as always, I want to bring it back to, ironically, action steps. And all I'm thinking right now is like the least and the most that I think we can do every day is wake up and ask ourselves, whom does the Grail serve? So that at least for every day, for that there is no self.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. That's profound.
Yeah. So before I wrap this up, I want to tell Chris and Joe actually that I just sent Ian the Robert Johnson He book. He just got it in the mail a few days ago.
It's gonna change your life.
Delicious.
I have pretty much his entire library, and I love it so much. And what I love is that it's so profoundly repetitive in nuanced ways. So he talks about the Fisher King in like 4 of his novels, and every time that he talks about it a little bit different and goes into different details or brings in some new interpretation that blows my mind. But what I love about the He book is that he goes into Perceval's journey so much more. And you really get a sense of why this is about Perceval, which you often don't get when you just read the myth, but you really understand who Perceval is and all the things that he endured and went through, and why it's brilliant. It's amazing. It's so good.
I told him I could hear his mind after he reads that, and I think we should do another one of these. Yeah, I think that you should pick a Pete Rollins video for the Alchemist to watch.
Okay.
We could discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's some rich stuff. So
All right. Well, this has been fun. Ian, thank you so much. Father Callahan, that's what I call him.
Well, thank you for having me. Absolutely. Pleasure. It's great meeting both of you fellas.
Thanks, Ian.